There is a scene I want you to hold in your mind before this lesson begins. A young woman stands in a grand office in Vienna before the director of one of the most prestigious opera houses in the world. She has come because she believes she can sing. Not casually, not hopefully. She knows it with the kind of certainty that has already shaped the direction of her entire life. The director studies her, but not her voice. He never truly listens for it. Instead, he notices the plain dress, the awkward posture, the face that does not resemble his idea of greatness. Then he delivers his judgment. With a face like that and no stage presence whatsoever, how could you ever expect to succeed in opera? My child, abandon this dream. Buy a sewing machine, find work. You will never become a singer. Never is a dangerous word when spoken to someone who refuses to accept it. That young woman was Ernestine Schumann-Heink. She would later become one of the most celebrated operatic voices in history. The man who dismissed her faded into obscurity. The voice he rejected filled concert halls across continents for decades. And the difference between the life she almost accepted and the life she ultimately created was not talent alone. It was one decision. She refused to let another person's opinion become the definition of her identity. That decision is the foundation of this entire lesson. Because after spending more than 20 years studying the men and women who built extraordinary lives, I discovered one principle that separates those who succeed from those who never fully begin. It is not intelligence, it is not background, it is not luck, it is the condition of the mind. It is the condition of the mind. A mind trained to expect victory behaves differently from a mind conditioned to expect defeat. And in this lesson, I will show you exactly how that conditioning happens, not as vague philosophy, not as motivational poetry, but as a practical method, step by step, principle by principle, story by story, until you understand not only what faith is, but how it is deliberately built and why, once established, it changes the direction of an entire life. Let us begin. Part 1. The mind that expects defeat will eventually create it. I want you to picture two men entering the exact same business venture during the same year. The first man prepared carefully. He studied every possible failure. He examined every collapsed business, every financial mistake, every competitor who had attempted the same idea and failed. He understood risk in exhaustive detail. He believed he was being responsible, practical, realistic. Then he launched the venture, and it failed. The second man approached the same opportunity differently. He did not ignore problems, but he refused to center his attention on them. Instead of rehearsing disaster, he disciplined his mind to focus on the result he intended to achieve. He held that image with certainty. He entered the same market, faced the same competition, operated under the same conditions. He succeeded. Now listen carefully, because this is not a comforting story meant to inspire temporary optimism. It is the operation of a law as precise as any law in nature. Every thought held consistently in the mind and energized by emotion eventually seeks expression in physical reality. Read that again in your mind, then read it once more. This is not wishful thinking. It is not naive positivity from someone untouched by hardship. It is a conclusion reached after examining more than 20,000 lives across every imaginable condition, from wealth to poverty, from triumph to collapse. Again and again, the external circumstances of a person's life reflected the dominant pattern of thought occupying the mind. The first man became consumed by the study of failure, not because he lacked courage, but because the human mind gradually adapts to whatever it repeatedly consumes. Feed it fear long enough, and fear becomes normal. Feed it doubt long enough, and doubt becomes expectation. I have expressed this principle many times in my work, and I want you to hear it clearly now. Success comes to those who become success conscious. Failure comes to those who unconsciously become failure conscious. One of the most successful bankers I ever met had a sign hanging in his office. I passed it many times before fully understanding its meaning. It read, "We speak and think only of abundance here. If you bring a story of misery, keep it outside." At first glance, it sounds almost arrogant, but look deeper. That man understood something with scientific precision. The atmosphere created by repeated thought affects every mind exposed to it. One person consumed by defeat can quietly weaken the energy, confidence, and creativity of everyone around them, because thoughts attract their equivalents. Thoughts of scarcity attract conditions of scarcity. Thoughts of abundance attract conditions of abundance. This is not sentiment, it is law. In countless homes I studied, the dominant conversation revolved around limitation. Families discussed hardship constantly. They worried about money, expected struggle, inherited fear from previous generations, and unknowingly trained their minds to reproduce the exact conditions they feared. And the subconscious mind, obedient and tireless, accepted those thoughts as instructions. Now let me show you the opposite principle through a man who mastered it intentionally. When Frank Woolworth announced he would sell products for 5 and 10 cents, experts warned him it could never work. They explained the margins were too small, the costs too high, the model unsustainable. The critics were not unintelligent. Their calculations were technically sound, but they underestimated the force of a mind trained to expect success. Woolworth did not waste energy arguing. He simply refused to internalize their conclusion. He moved forward with unwavering faith and a definite purpose. The fortune he eventually built exceeded $100 million. What Woolworth possessed was not a mystical gift. It was the disciplined ability to protect his mind from negative suggestion, and that ability can be learned. But before I explain how, I want you to examine your own thinking honestly. Think about the thing you truly want most in life, not the polite ambition you casually mention to others. The real one, the desire that returns in quiet moments when no one is listening. Now ask yourself, when you imagine achieving it, what feeling appears first? Do you feel certainty, direction, the calm confidence of someone who already sees the destination forming? Or do you immediately begin listing obstacles, statistics, reasons others failed, reasons you may not be capable? If the second response feels familiar, understand what it is costing you, because that habit is not caution, it is conditioning, and the subconscious mind accepts repeated conditioning as reality. The purpose of this lesson is to change that conditioning, not someday, tonight. Part 2. Faith is not something you are born with, it is something you build. I want to tell you about a moment that changed my understanding of faith forever. I stood beside the bed of my newborn son while a doctor news no parent wishes to hear. The child had been born without normal hearing. The doctor explained carefully and compassionately that he might never hear or speak. Outwardly, I remained calm, but inwardly I rejected the verdict completely. Not emotionally, not rebelliously, quietly. I decided my son would hear and speak. Not that I hoped he might, not that I wished for it. I decided it with finality, the way a man chooses a destination before beginning a journey. The destination was fixed. The path would reveal itself later. Over the years that followed, I repeated one message to my son constantly. I told him his condition was not a curse, but a hidden advantage. I planted in his mind the expectation that he would one day hear and communicate normally. Not occasionally, relentlessly. Every story, every conversation, every encouragement carried the same emotional certainty. Eventually, he believed it too. And the subconscious mind, once fully convinced, began organizing reality around that belief. Doctors could not explain the progress he made. Specialists admitted there was no clear medical reason for the level of hearing he eventually developed, but the mechanism was clear to me. Faith combined with repeated emotional suggestion changed the direction of his life, and this mechanism applies to every human being. Faith is not magic. It is a mental condition created through repeated, emotionalized thought. That is why repetition matters. Not weak repetition. Not mechanical affirmations spoken without feeling, genuine emotional repetition. I developed what I called the self-confidence formula for this exact reason. You write a clear statement describing the person you intend to become and the purpose you are committed to achieving. You state it positively and decisively, not, I hope. But I know I possess the ability to achieve this outcome, and I demand persistent action from myself until it is accomplished. You define what you will give in exchange for what you want, because the subconscious mind responds to commitment, not entitlement. Then you read that statement aloud every morning and every night. Not silently, aloud. Because spoken words heard by your own ears penetrate deeper into the subconscious. And here's the principle behind it all. A person eventually believes whatever they repeatedly themselves with emotional conviction, true or false. That law operates constantly. The individual who repeatedly rehearses limitation develops faith in limitation. The individual who repeatedly rehearses possibility develops faith in possibility. The question is not whether you are using autosuggestion, you already are. The question is whether you are using it intentionally. Begin tonight, write the statement. Read it before sleep. Read it again before the day begins. And continue until belief replaces hesitation. Part 3. The man whose engineers said impossible. I want to tell you about a year in which absolutely nothing appeared to happen. Henry Ford instructed his engineers to build an 8-cylinder engine cast in a single block. The experts examined the idea and concluded it could not be done. They explained the limitations, the technical barriers, the engineering realities. Ford listened carefully. Then he said, "Build it anyway." Months passed, no solution. A year passed, still impossible. The engineers returned with the same conclusion. Ford answered with the same response. Continue. Eventually, after relentless effort, the solution emerged, and the impossible engine became reality. What Ford understood was revolutionary. The mind is not designed merely to accept the world as it currently exists. It is capable of imagining what does not yet exist and moving reality toward it. His engineers understood present limitations. Ford focused on future possibility. That distinction changed history, and the principle behind it is simple. Whatever the mind can clearly conceive and genuinely believe, it can eventually achieve. Not merely conceive and believe. Belief is the force that transforms imagination into action. Thomas Edison demonstrated the same principle when critics insisted no machine could record the human voice. George Washington demonstrated it when experts declared victory impossible. Milo Jones demonstrated it from a sickbed after paralysis destroyed his physical mobility. Unable to work with his hands, he built a successful national business through organized thought and determined leadership. Again and again, the same law appears. Where directed thought persists, power follows. Now, perhaps you hear these stories and quietly think, these men were extraordinary. My doubt is too strong. Listen carefully. Doubt is not permanent. It is habit, and habits can be replaced. Faith grows through repetition, attention, emotional reinforcement, and daily practice. You do not need to begin with absolute certainty. You only need to begin. Part 4. Training the mind through daily practice. Imagine the subconscious mind as a fertile garden. Whatever is planted there grows. Faith grows. Fear grows. Abundance grows. Scarcity grows. The garden itself is neutral. It does not judge the seed. And here is the most important truth. The subconscious mind never stops receiving truth. The subconscious mind never stops receiving seeds. Every conversation, every environment, every voice, every repeated thought enters the soil. If you do not plant intentionally, the world will plant for you. And the default seeds of the modern world are fear, anxiety, limitation, and distraction. That is why deliberate mental training is essential. A poverty mindset develops automatically. An abundance mindset must be built consciously. Speak about possibility. Think about possibility. Not to deny current circumstances, but to train the mind toward the future you intend to create. And protect your mental environment carefully. Association matters. Negative minds transfer doubt constantly, often without realizing it. One deeply pessimistic person can slowly poison the confidence of an entire group. Choose your closest influences with intention. You do not need cruelty. You do not need conflict, but you do need awareness. Counter negative influence daily with your own deliberate conditioning. Read your statement every morning and everything with emotion. See the outcome vividly. Feel it as real. At first, it may feel unnatural. Continue anyway. Emotion deepens belief. Repetition deepens emotion. Eventually, the pattern becomes automatic. That is how faith is built, not instantly, daily. And consistency matters more than intensity. Sporadic effort produces sporadic results. The subconscious mind responds to repetition, not occasional enthusiasm. Build the habit until it becomes part of your identity. Part 5. What if it actually works out? I want to return to the young woman standing before the opera director in Vienna. The defining moment was not his criticism. It was her response to it. She decided that another person's judgment would not become the authority over her future. That decision is available to you right now. You can choose the thoughts that dominate your mind, and that choice determines the direction of your life more than circumstance ever will. So now I ask you the real question behind this entire lesson. What if it actually works out? What if the dream you secretly carry is possible? What if the life you imagine during your clearest moments is not fantasy, but potential waiting for commitment? Most people avoid fully believing because belief creates responsibility. If you truly expect success, you must pursue it seriously. You lose the protection of cynicism, and many people would rather protect themselves from disappointment than risk wholehearted effort. But the man who expects success behaves differently. He notices opportunities others ignore. He persists longer. He recovers faster. He acts with direction instead of hesitation. And over time, those differences produce radically different outcomes. Faith organizes the subconscious mind around achievement. It creates persistence, energy, initiative, creative thought, strategic action, and eventually the external world begins reflecting the internal expectation. So let me leave you with the 5 stages underlying every achievement. Desire, the seed; faith, the emotional certainty that nourishes it; decision, the commitment; decision, the commitment to act; action, daily disciplined effort; persistence, continuing long after doubt demands retreat. The second decision is always the most important one. Not the emotional beginning, the quiet continuation when no evidence has appeared yet. That is where destiny changes. The individual who continues through that invisible phase eventually reaches the breakthrough. Like Ford, like Schumann-Heink, like every person who refused to surrender authority over their mind. So begin tonight, not when fear disappears, not when conditions improve. Begin now. Write the statement, sign it, read it aloud, and ask yourself with genuine expectation, what if it actually works out? Because if you train your mind consistently enough, one day you may discover something extraordinary. There is another truth that must now be understood, because many men begin the journey of rebuilding the mind with excitement, only to discover a difficulty they did not expect. The difficulty is not the world. It is not competition. It is not lack of opportunity. The difficulty is endurance. Most people can feel inspired for a day. Some can remain disciplined for a week. Very few can continue after the emotional intensity fades and the ordinary weight of life returns. Yet that ordinary season is where nearly every meaningful transformation is decided. I want you to understand something clearly. The subconscious mind does not respond to occasional declarations. It responds to repeated identity. It watches what you consistently do, not what you temporarily feel. A man may speak, it responds to repeated identity. It watches what you consistently do, not what you temporarily feel. A man may speak confidently for one evening and still carry a lifetime of doubt beneath the surface. The subconscious mind recognizes the deeper pattern every single time. This is why temporary motivation changes so little. A man watches a powerful lecture, feels energy moving through him, imagines a new future, and for several hours he believes himself transformed. But the next morning he returns to the same habits, the same conversations, the same fearful assumptions, the same internal language. And because the dominant pattern has not changed, the results do not change either. Emotion may begin the movement. Identity sustains it. You must become the kind of person whose daily behavior matches the future you claim to desire. Not occasionally, repeatedly, quietly, especially on the days when no visible progress appears. I have studied men who achieved extraordinary fortunes, and I noticed something remarkable among nearly all of them. They stopped consulting their moods before taking action. The average man asks himself each morning whether he feels ready. The successful man asks only whether the action moves him toward the objective. That distinction seems small. It is enormous. The man ruled by emotion becomes inconsistent. His productivity rises and falls with circumstance. But the man ruled by purpose develops rhythm, and rhythm, once established, becomes power. Think of the musician who practices scales long before performing in concert halls. Think of the athlete repeating movements thousands of times before the champions. Think of the athlete repeating movements thousands of times before the championship arrives. Repetition appears unimpressive while it is happening. Yet, repetition is precisely what creates mastery. The same law governs the mind. Every time you choose discipline over avoidance, you strengthen a new internal identity. Every time you continue despite uncertainty, you teach the subconscious mind that persistence is now part of your nature. And eventually, there comes a moment when the behavior that once required effort begins to feel natural. That is the turning point most people never reach because they quit too early. They mistake the absence of immediate results for evidence that the process is failing. But nature itself does not operate that way. A seed planted beneath the earth does not erupt to a tree the following morning. For a long period, all meaningful growth remains invisible. The roots form first. Your own transformation follows the same law. Long before the world sees evidence, the internal structure is changing. The roots form first. Your own transformation follows the same law. Long before the world sees evidence, the internal structure is changing. Your attention changes, your reactions change, your standards change, your tolerance for distraction weakens, your expectation rises. The mind begins reorganizing itself around the image you have repeatedly impressed upon it. And then one day, what once felt impossible begins to feel inevitable. People call this confidence. But confidence is not something granted by fortune. It is accumulated evidence created through repeated self-trust. Each kept promise strengthens it. Each completed action reinforces it. Each moment of persistence adds another layer to the identity being built. Now I want to warn you about a danger that appears precisely when progress begins. As your standards rise, many people around you may become uncomfortable. Not because your growth harms them, but because your discipline reminds them that appears precisely when progress begins. As your standards rise, many people around you may become uncomfortable. Not because your growth harms them, but because your discipline reminds them of their own neglected potential. Some will mock your ambition indirectly. Others will encourage moderation disguised as wisdom. A few will quietly hope you return to the smaller version of yourself that required nothing from them. Do not resent them. Most people defend the limits they have accepted because those limits protect them from confronting change. Remember this without bitterness and continue forward anyway. You are not required to convince everyone of your vision. In fact, excessive explanation often weakens conviction. Protect the early stages of your growth the way a gardener protects a young plant before the roots are strong enough to survive harsh weather. Work quietly. Let the results speak later. There is another mistake I must address because it destroys momentum. Work quietly. Let the results speak later. There is another mistake I must address because it destroys momentum in capable people. Many become so obsessed with the final outcome that they lose respect for the daily process producing it. They want certainty immediately. They want proof before persistence. They demand visible success before fully committing themselves. But life rarely rewards that order. First comes commitment, then comes evidence. The man who waits to feel fully confident before taking action will remain motionless for years. Action to feel fully confident before taking action will remain motionless for years. Action creates confidence far more reliably than thought ever will. Movement teaches the mind that progress is possible. And once the mind accepts progress as possible, it begins cooperating instead of resisting. This is why even small actions matter. A single disciplined morning matters. A single completed task matters. A single moment in which you override the old pattern matters. Because every repeated action casts another vote for the person you are becoming. And eventually the votes accumulate. The identity changes. At that point, success no longer feels like something distant that belongs to other people. It begins to feel like the natural consequence of the person you have trained yourself to become. That is the true purpose of faith, not blind optimism. Alignment. Faith aligns thought with action, action with identity, and identity with destiny. Without that alignment, desire remains fantasy. With it, even ordinary individuals become capable of extraordinary results. So I ask you once more to examine yourself honestly tonight. What patterns are you reinforcing every day? What thoughts dominate the private conversations inside your mind? What identity are your habits silently building? Because whether you realize it or not, you are already becoming someone through repetition. Whether you realize it or not, you are already becoming someone through repetition. The only remaining question is whether that transformation is happening by design or by default. Decide deliberately. Guard your mind carefully. Repeat the vision daily. Act before you feel fully prepared. Continue after the excitement fades. And understand this above all else. The future rarely belongs to the most talented person in the room. More often, it belongs to the individual who refused to stop training the mind toward the life they intended to create. There comes a stage in every meaningful pursuit where the battle changes completely. At first, the struggle is visible. It appears as lack of money, lack of opportunity, lack of knowledge, lack of support. The obstacles seem external, but after a certain point, the real conflict becomes invisible. It becomes the daily negotiation between the person you have been and the person you are attempting to become. Most men never recognize this transition. They continue trying to change their results without changing the internal standard from which those results are produced. They attempt to force a new future while emotionally remaining loyal to an old identity. And because the subconscious mind always works to preserve what feels familiar, it quietly pulls them back toward the life they already believe they deserve. Understand this clearly. Human beings do not consistently outperform their self-image for long. Eventually, behavior returns to the level of identity. That is why a man may earn success and then destroy it. Why another may discover opportunity and still fail to act. Why some people sabotage relationships, health, finances, or careers precisely when improvement begins. Their outer conditions changed faster than their inner beliefs. The subconscious mind protects what it accepts as normal. If struggle feels normal, peace will feel suspicious. If limitation feels normal, abundance will feel dangerous. If disappointment feels familiar, success itself may create discomfort. This is why the rebuilding of identity is not optional. It is the work. You must train yourself not only to desire a greater life, but to emotionally accept it as natural. At first, this feels unnatural because the old conditioning resists replacement. The mind clings to familiar patterns. It feels unnatural because the old conditioning resists replacement. The mind clings to familiar patterns, even when those patterns create suffering. Familiar pain often feels safer than unfamiliar possibility. That is one of the great tragedies of human potential. But the conditioning can be changed, and it changes through evidence created by action. Every disciplined decision sends a message to the subconscious mind. I am no longer the person who quits. I am no longer the person who hides. I am no longer the person who waits for permission. Identity is shaped through repeated proof. This is why promises made only in thought accomplish so little. The subconscious mind trusts demonstration more than intention. It believes what you repeatedly demonstration more than intention. It believes what you repeatedly do. If a man declares ambition while practicing avoidance, the subconscious mind accepts avoidance as truth. If he speaks about confidence while constantly retreating from challenge, the mind accepts fear as identity. But when action repeatedly contradicts the old pattern, the internal image begins to shift. And once identity shifts, behavior begins to flow with far less resistance. That is the moment discipline transforms into self-respect. I want you to notice something important about the people who accomplish remarkable things. They are not free from fear. They simply stop treating fear as authority. The average man experiences uncertainty and immediately interprets it as a signal to retreat. The successful man experiences uncertainty and interprets it as the price of expansion. The feeling may be identical. The interpretation changes everything. Fear is often nothing more than the nervous system encountering unfamiliar territory. Yet most people mistake unfamiliarity for danger and return immediately to the comfort of old limitations. In doing so, they unknowingly train themselves to remain small. Growth requires tolerance for temporary discomfort. Not endless suffering, not self-destruction, but the willingness to remain steady while the old identity dissolves and the new one strengthens. There will be days when progress feels invisible, days when the mind attempts to negotiate a return to familiar habits, days when the vision seems distant and the effort appears larger than the reward. Continue anyway, because persistence is not merely the continuation of action. It is the refusal to surrender the identity you are building. Surrender the identity you are building. A man who persists long enough eventually reaches a threshold where his standards become stronger than his excuses. At that point, external motivation becomes less necessary because the new behavior no longer feels forced. It feels consistent with who he believes himself to be. That is why transformation appears sudden to outside observers. They see the visible breakthrough, but not the months or years of invisible conditions that preceded it. They see the business succeed, but not the mornings the man worked while uncertain. They see the confident speaker, but not the years spent overcoming hesitation. They see the disciplined body, but not the repeated private decisions that built it. The world notices outcomes. The subconscious mind notices repetition. Never confuse the two. Now I want to speak about patience, because impatience destroys many intelligent people. The modern mind has become addicted to immediate evidence. People plant seeds in the morning and dig them up at night, searching for proof of growth. They abandon methods too quickly. They interrupt momentum before momentum has time to compound. But every meaningful achievement contains a period where nothing appears to happen externally. That period is not empty. It is preparation. Nature builds silently. Foundations strengthen underground. Character forms privately. Mental conditioning deepens beneath visible behavior long before results emerge. Respect that invisible season. The man who continues during that period gains an advantage most people never experience because most people stop before the compounding effect begins. They quit during the quiet phase where persistence matters most. Do not make that mistake. You are closer to momentum than you think. One disciplined day strengthens the next. One completed action increases belief. One kept promise improves self-trust. Promise improves self-trust. Gradually, the mind stops identifying with weakness and begins identifying with capability. And capability, repeated consistently, becomes power. There is another principle you must understand if you wish to sustain long-term growth. Your environment must eventually reflect your standards. If your surroundings constantly reinforce distraction, negativity, and mediocrity, maintaining elevated thinking becomes unnecessarily difficult. This applies to physical spaces, digital spaces, conversations, entertainment, and relationships. Every environment trains the mind. Ask yourself honestly, does your environment strengthen your future or reinforce your past? Because the human mind adapts remarkably fast to repeated exposure. Place yourself continually among ambitious, disciplined, forward-moving individuals, and your standards begin rising automatically. Surround yourself with cynicism, excuses, and passive thinking, and your ambition gradually weakens without you noticing. Guard the gates of your attention. Attention is one of the most valuable forms of power you possess because whatever consistently captures attention eventually shapes identity. And in the modern world, countless forces compete aggressively for control of it. Most people surrender their attention carelessly. They consume confusion every morning, distraction throughout the day, and negativity before sleep, then wonder why clarity feels difficult to maintain. Protect your mind with intention. Feed it direction instead of noise. Feed it vision instead of fear. Feed it purpose instead of endless comparison. Because eventually the mind becomes whatever it repeatedly consumes. And now, before we continue further, I want you to pause internally for one honest moment and consider this question carefully. If you fully believed your life could become greater than it is today, what would you stop tolerating immediately? That question matters because standards reveal identity. The moment a man truly believes he is meant for more, certain habits become unacceptable to him. Certain environments become unbearable. Certain excuses lose their power. Belief changes behavior before results arrive. That is why the training of the mind must always come first. Everything else follows from there. First, everything else follows from there. And now we arrive at a principle so important that an entire life may rise or fall upon whether it is understood correctly. The principle is this: attention is creative. Whatever consistently occupies the mind begins slowly and invisibly to organize behavior around itself. A man who continually studies obstacles becomes increasingly skilled at recognizing obstacles. A man who continually studies opportunity becomes increasingly capable of recognizing opportunity. The external world has not changed nearly as much as the direction of attention has changed. Most people underestimate the power of this completely. They believe thought is passive, something private and harmless, disconnected from material outcomes. But thought is never passive for long. Thought repeated becomes emotion. Emotion repeated becomes attitude. Attitude repeated becomes behavior. And behavior repeated becomes destiny. The chain is so gradual that most men do not notice it while it is happening. Behavior repeated becomes destiny. The chain is so gradual that most men do not notice it while it is happening. A person does not suddenly become disciplined. He becomes disciplined through hundreds of moments in which he chooses action over delay. A person does not suddenly become defeated. He becomes defeated through repeated surrender to discouragement until discouragement begins to feel natural. Character is not formed in dramatic moments alone. It is formed in repetition. This is why the smallest daily decisions deserve far more respect than they are usually given. The way you begin your morning matters. The conversations you repeatedly entertain matter. The standards you enforce when no one is watching matter. Each decision appears insignificant in isolation, yet together they construct the architecture of identity. And identity, once stabilized, begins directing life automatically. I have watched men spend years attempting to change out, and identity, once stabilized, begins directing life automatically. I have watched men spend years attempting to change outcomes while fiercely protecting the habits producing those outcomes. They wanted confidence without discomfort, success without discipline, transformation without interruption of routine. But reality does not operate that way. A new life requires a new structure. The old habits cannot carry you into a fundamentally different future because those habits were designed for the current version of you. If you wish to produce different results, you must gradually become someone capable of producing them consistently. This is why sacrifice is unavoidable, not punishment. Exchange. Every meaningful gain requires the surrender of something smaller. To gain clarity, distraction must be surrendered. To gain strength, comfort must be surrendered. To gain growth, familiar limitations must be surrendered. And here is the remarkable truth many people discover too late. Strength, comfort must be surrendered. To gain growth, familiar limitations must be surrendered. And here is the remarkable truth many people discover too late. What you surrender was never serving you nearly as much as you imagined. The distracted man fears discipline until discipline gives him peace. The insecure man fears challenge until challenge gives him confidence. The hesitant man fears commitment until commitment gives him direction. The hesitant man fears commitment until commitment gives him direction. Human beings often cling to the very habits creating their frustrations simply because those habits feel familiar. That is why courage is required. Not only the courage to begin, but the courage to release identities that no longer deserve residence within your life. You cannot build a powerful future while remaining emotionally committed to weakness. Eventually, a decision must be made. The mind cannot permanently move in two directions at once. Now, I want to speak about responsibility because many people misunderstand it completely. Responsibility is not punishment, it is power. The moment a man accepts responsibility for the direction of his mind, he stops waiting for rescue. He stops negotiating endlessly with circumstance. He stops placing the authority for his future into the hands of critics, governments, luck, or the opinions of others. And that moment changes him. Because the individual who accepts responsibility gains access to possibility. As long as blame dominates the mind, action weakens. Blame creates passivity because it convinces a person that responsibility gains access to possibility. As long as blame dominates the mind, action weakens. Blame creates passivity because it convinces a person that progress depends primarily on forces outside themselves. Responsibility does the opposite. Responsibility redirects attention toward what can still be shaped, improved, strengthened, and controlled. That shift alone can transform an entire existence. The successful individual asks a different set of questions than the defeated individual. Instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" he asks, "What must I become to move beyond this?" That question produces movement, and movement is essential because stagnation intensifies fear. The longer action is delayed, the heavier action begins to feel. Delay magnifies difficulty in the imagination, but action reduces fear because action interrupts overthinking. Even imperfect movement creates momentum. That is why decisive individuals often outperform. But action reduces fear because action interrupts overthinking. Even imperfect movement creates momentum. That is why decisive individuals often outperform more intelligent people who remain trapped in hesitation. The decisive person learns through movement, while the hesitant person waits endlessly for certainty, and certainty rarely arrives before action. Life reveals the next step only after the current one is taken. This is difficult for the modern mind because people want guarantees before commitment. They want assurance before effort. But nearly every meaningful achievement in history required movement before evidence appeared. Faith does not eliminate uncertainty. It teaches a person how to move through uncertainty without surrendering direction. And this ability becomes increasingly valuable as life grows more demanding. Because there will be seasons where results slow down, seasons where effort appears unanswered, seasons where fatigue attempts to weaken conviction. In those moments, many individuals abandon the process entirely because they depended too heavily on visible rewards to maintain discipline. In those moments, many individuals abandon the process entirely because they depended too heavily on visible rewards to maintain discipline. But the mature mind learns something deeper. It learns to value alignment over immediate applause. The disciplined individual continues not merely because results have arrived, but because continuing itself has become part of personal integrity. The action reflects identity now. The standard remains even when emotion fluctuates. This is freedom of a very rare kind. Most people are controlled by mood, controlled by external reaction, controlled by convenience. But the individual who governs himself through principle instead of impulse develops a stability that external conditions cannot easily destroy. And stability creates power. Not loud power, not theatrical power, quiet power. The power of a person who no longer needs perfect circumstances in order to continue forward. That kind of individual becomes dangerous to limitation because obstacles stop functioning as final verdicts. Obstacles become temporary conditions to navigate rather than permanent identities to accept. There is another thing I want you to remember carefully. Your identities to accept. There is another thing I want you to remember carefully. Your future self is built through conversation long before it is built through achievement. The internal dialogue you repeat daily becomes the emotional climate in which your identity develops. If the inner voice constantly repeats weakness, failure, comparison, and defeat, the subconscious mind accepts those patterns as truth. But if the inner voice repeatedly reinforces discipline, resilience, capability, and growth, the subconscious mind gradually reorganizes around those expectations instead. This is why language matters. Words shape emotional states. Emotional states shape behavior, and behavior shapes outcomes. Never speak carelessly about yourself for prolonged periods of time. A joke repeated often enough becomes instruction to the subconscious mind. A limitation repeated long enough becomes identity. Speak carefully, not artificially, not arrogantly, truthfully, but constructively. Train yourself to speak in the direction you intend to move. And finally, I want to leave you with one observation that I believe separates those who permanently transform from those who repeatedly restart. The people who truly change stop viewing growth as a temporary project. It becomes a way of living. They stop asking when discipline will no longer be necessary because they understand discipline is not the enemy of freedom. Proper discipline creates freedom. Freedom from chaos, freedom from regret, freedom from wasted potential. At some point, the question changes from how long must I force myself to continue to why would I ever return to the person I used to be? That is when transformation becomes permanent, not when motivation peaks, when identity changes completely. And identity changes through the repeated training of thought, emotion, action, and attention day after day until the new way of living no longer feels like effort. It feels like truth. Action and attention day after day until the new way of living no longer feels like effort. It feels like truth. There is one final illusion I want to remove before this lesson moves forward, because it quietly destroys more potential than failure itself ever could. It is the illusion that time alone changes a person. Time changes nothing by itself. Years may pass while the mind remains trapped in the same emotional patterns, the same fears, the same excuses, the same unconscious expectations. A man may grow older without ever truly growing. Experience alone does not produce wisdom. Repeated reflection and deliberate correction produce wisdom. Some people spend decades rehearsing the same limitations until those limitations become indistinguishable from personality. They begin introducing themselves through their disappointments. They speak of missed opportunities as though fate carved them, introducing themselves through their disappointments. They speak of missed opportunities as though fate carved them permanently into the structure of life. And gradually, without realizing it, they stop imagining a greater future because they have become emotionally loyal to an old story. Be careful with the stories you repeat about yourself. The human mind is constantly searching for consistency between identity and behavior. If a person repeatedly describes himself as unlucky, overlooked, incapable, broken, or behind, the subconscious mind begins organizing behavior around maintaining that description. Not because suffering is desired, but because familiarity feels psychologically safe. This is why transformation often feels uncomfortable long before it feels empowering. Growth requires the interruption of familiar emotional patterns. It asks a person to release interpretations that may have existed for years, and the mind resists that release because identity, even painful identity, provides certainty. But the future cannot be built from constant rehearsal of the past. At some point, a decision must be made to stop worshiping old versions of yourself, not denying them, not pretending difficulties never existed, but refusing to build permanent residence inside them. A difficult chapter is not meant to become your entire identity. The strongest people I have studied were not necessarily those who avoided hardship. Often they experienced identity. The strongest people I have studied were not necessarily those who avoided hardship. Often they experienced extraordinary hardship. The difference was that they refused to convert pain into permanent self-definition. They suffered without surrendering vision. They struggled without abandoning possibility. And that distinction changed everything. Now listen carefully, because this principle is essential. The subconscious mind responds not only to what you say, but to what you emotionally rehearse. A person may verbally declare ambition, emotionally rehearse. A person may verbally declare ambition while mentally replaying defeat every night. The spoken words carry little force if the emotional imagination consistently moves in the opposite direction. This is why visualization, when properly understood, becomes so powerful. Visualization is not fantasy. It is rehearsal. The athlete mentally rehearses victory before the competition begins. The speaker mentally rehearses composure before stepping onto the stage. The builder mentally sees the structure before laying the foundation. In each case, the mind becomes familiar with the desired outcome before physical evidence fully appears. And familiarity changes behavior. The subconscious mind moves more confidently toward what feels known. That is why fear decreases after repeated exposure. What once felt impossible gradually becomes manageable, then achievable, then eventually normal. The same law applies to success itself. If abundance, confidence, discipline, or leadership feel emotionally foreign, the mind will unconsciously resist them. But repeated mental exposure begins dissolving that resistance. You must become internally familiar with the life you intend to create. See it clearly. Feel the emotional atmosphere of it, not as desperate wishing, but as preparation. The mind performs best when it stops treating possibility as distant and begins treating it as direction. There is another mistake many people make during periods of growth, treating possibility as distant and begins treating it as direction. There is another mistake many people make during periods of growth. They become obsessed with speed. They compare their progress constantly against the visible achievements of others. And comparison, when repeated long enough, poisons gratitude, weakens focus, and creates unnecessary discouragement. Remember this carefully. Every life moves according to different timing, different pressures, different lessons, different responsibilities. Comparison destroys concentration because it redirects energy away from your own path toward someone else's. The disciplined mind learns to measure progress against previous versions of itself. Are you thinking more clearly than before? Acting more consistently than before? Recovering faster from setbacks than before? Maintaining standards more effectively than before? That is real progress. Small improvements repeated consistently create radical transformation. Maintaining standards more effectively than before? That is real progress. Small improvements repeated consistently create radical transformation over time. Yet, because the changes happen gradually, many people underestimate their significance while they are occurring. They do not realize the person they are becoming until one day they respond to a situation differently than they once would have. That moment matters. When discipline replaces avoidance, when calm replaces panic, when action replaces hesitation, when responsibility replaces blame. That is evidence the identity is changing at the root level, and root level change produces lasting results. Now I want to speak about setbacks because no meaningful life escapes them. There will be moments where plans collapse unexpectedly, effort may go unrewarded, trusted people may disappoint you, circumstances may temporarily move backward instead of forward. Do not interpret those moments incorrectly. A setback forward. Do not interpret those moments incorrectly. A setback is information, not identity. The average person experiences difficulty and immediately personalizes it. This means I am failing. This means I am not capable. This means the vision was unrealistic. But the stronger mind interprets difficulty differently. What must be adjusted? What can be learned? What remains possible from here? That interpretation, what can be learned? What remains possible from here? That interpretation preserves momentum. And momentum matters enormously because the greatest danger during hardship is not temporary failure. It is psychological surrender. Once the mind accepts defeat internally, behavior soon follows. Protect the mind, especially during difficult seasons. Speak carefully during those periods. Choose influences carefully. Continue the habits even when emotion weakens, especially then. Because consistency during adversity strengthens identity faster than consistency during comfort ever could. Anyone can maintain vision while circumstances are favorable. The true test arrives when evidence temporarily disappears, and yet, strangely enough, that is often the exact season where the deepest internal growth is occurring. Pressure reveals structure. A weak foundation collapses under difficulty. A disciplined foundation strengthens through it. This is why adversity sometimes produces extraordinary individuals. Hardship forces clarity. It strips away illusion. It demands adaptation. Adversity sometimes produces extraordinary individuals. Hardship forces clarity. It strips away illusion. It demands adaptation. And if the mind responds correctly, struggle becomes training instead of destruction, but only if meaning is attached to it constructively. Never waste suffering by allowing it to produce only bitterness. Let it produce depth, strength, patience, perspective, precision. The individual who learns this becomes increasingly difficult to defeat because external events no longer fully control internal direction. And that is true power, not the absence of obstacles, the ability to continue despite them. So if you find yourself tonight standing between the old version of yourself and the future version, you can already sense somewhere ahead. Understand this clearly. The distance between those two identities is crossed through repeated daily choices, not dramatic moments. One thought at a time. One action at a time. One discipline is crossed through repeated daily choices, not dramatic moments. one thought at a time, one action at a time, one disciplined decision at a time, until eventually the person you once hoped to become begins speaking through your actions naturally. And when that day arrives, you will understand something most people never fully realize. The transformation was never happening only around you. It was happening within you first. It was happening within you first.